Well, welcome everybody to another edition of the Psych Monologues. I am Dr. Ray Mitch, your host, although right now it doesn't look like I am, since if you're watching the video podcast, you are watching and seeing a piece of stained glass of a golden retriever. So if you get tired of looking at my mug, you can certainly look at this pretty easily, and I'll explain just in a second why I'm doing this, because that is part of what this particular episode is really all about. So, what is the Psych Monologue? It's a podcast that explores the intersection of faith, psychology, and spiritual formation, its relationship to the larger group or organization called Stained Glass International, or SGI, and the mission is to equip, encourage, and empower the next generation of Christians to live authentically in relationship to Jesus, others, and with themselves. What we're trying to accomplish and to do is to create what I call outposts for the heart and communities for the soul. We can do that in a variety of ways, and this is, like I said, this stained glass is probably a little bit more pleasing to the eye, certainly, than I am. The other ministry of SGI is sponsoring and leading silent retreats for young people that introduce them to what that is like and why that is so important. Now, to the point, why, and you're in the right place, but why are you sitting, looking, or whatever it is you're doing, at a piece of stained glass? And there's a reason for that, partly because of what I want to focus on today and why this is so important, because otherwise you interact with me behind the stained glass. All you know of me is what you see. It is a simple solution to a very complex problem, and that is me. So oftentimes we settle for a lesser solution. It is a lot easier to change the stained glass than it is to change parts of me. So I settle for something that looks good rather than is good or is acceptable. And the key to what I want to pay attention to today is an external solution, which is what stained glass is, to an internal problem, and that is me. The interesting thing about this is that I can be anything I want on the backside, and you would never know it. So I can add one small detail to this and continue to have what looks like all the freedom in the world, and then you will not know what that is, because the only way you would know is if the stained glass is taken away. And I can continue to do this all day. For example, I can also do this. And I can create an appearance that is acceptable and socially approved, or at least approved by you, and you won't know what is going on behind that glass until or if I were to change it, right? And each change that I make is according to where I am, but nothing changes out here. You're still looking at a golden retriever. You don't see the fact that small changes like what I just did and what I am doing now exist. And I can change clothes, I can change hats, I can change sunglasses, I can change all sorts of things easily. And even with the things that are going on behind the stained glass, you will never know unless I allow you to see. And in a lot of ways, we keep looking for, and I'm going to jump to the end and I'll fill it in as we go, but we can look for an external solution to an internal problem. This is a whole lot easier than this. And so on that point, let me put that down and not make sure that it falls apart. That was a very kind gift that I was given a few years back by a student who was graduating, and she was very aware of my love for golden retrievers, and also my vision of what Stained Glass International would look like. And so she gifted me with that, which is wonderful, given the fact that it wasn't all that long after she gave it to me that we had to say goodbye to our golden retriever, 16 years. And so, simple solutions to complex problems, external solutions to internal problems. So what I want to do today is continue our conversation about anxiety, actually. And this is off the beaten track. Again, if you've ever been in any of my classes, this is not unusual. I oftentimes will get hijacked by some ideas, and I want to run down them because I sense it being relevant to the people that I'm talking to. So we were talking about anxiety last week, and I talked a little bit about the difference between anxiety and fear, and something that happened, and this is just a backstory, okay, just for you all that are listening. I was in a discussion in a group of guys, and we were talking about Matthew 5, I should say. I think that's 5. No, it's 6. I was right. And it was a section that Jesus spent time talking about anxiety, okay? And he starts out very bluntly to say, don't be anxious, which is a tall order for us as humans at all. And what I noticed, even as I was sitting listening to the guys read from their variety of different translations, is either anxiety, the word anxiety is used, or worry is used. And the fascinating thing about reading any translation is it was translated of the words of the time. Not only the time in which the translators are operating, but they're also trying to figure out how to translate an ancient language that is not used as much and translate it into our everyday language. So they search for words that are the closest match for what is there in the original text. And there were a couple different words that were used. One, anxiety, we already talked a little bit about, that it is, what's interesting about the word anxiety is that it often points to being fragmented. And that's pretty accurate when you talk about anxiety, is very tied to fear, which we talked last week about. And I'll point you back to looking at that one first before you listen through this one, because fear is the immediate threat that we experience by whatever threat that is, whether it's a physical threat or whether it's even an emotional, psychological threat. Our body responds exactly the same way. It does not differentiate, which ends up creating this scenario that you have people talking about anxiety attacks, right? But the other word that came up was worry. And worry in the English language has a very rich history. And the original word that is Old English that we use for the word worry, and it actually means literally to strangle. And if you ask anybody who wrestles with worry, that it strangles their view of everything, the future, of themselves, of others. They are focused entirely on whatever it is. And there is a particular quality of worry that is ruminative. We roll it over in our minds over and over and over again. And the funny thing about it is, even though we run it through our minds, it always comes up with the same conclusion, and that is it will be catastrophic. Whatever comes out of this, it will be catastrophic. Now, I connected up in the last podcast how much worry, anxiety, fear are all connected to the issue of control. Now, control is an interesting one because oftentimes whenever I talk about it, people people's eyes kind of glaze over because it's like a foregone conclusion of our existence is the issue of control. Now, we all know and agree that it is bad to be a controlling, quote unquote, controlling person. But we don't really examine the things that are going on inside of us that actually provide the roots for control in relationships, control in dealing with ourselves, whatever that might be. And we have a particular ignorance of the familiar. And the interesting thing about humans, just to give you a quick psych lesson here, the interesting thing about humans, it's actually wired into our physiology to ignore things over time, to ignore things that stay the same, because we have to process so much stuff anyway that we can be relatively assured that the things that we see are not going to change, then we can focus our attention on all the things that are. But it is wired into our physiology, and we tend not to attend to things that do not change. Now, let me give you an example. It's a physiological one, not real complicated, but the word we use is habituation. And the best example I can give you is put a bowl of hot water, not scalding, of course, but hot water. Put your hand in it, and you may recoil because it's a little warm, but then you'll put your hand in it very, very gently, and before too long, you're resting in the hot water. And we do this with cold as well. And we have that cold, like a cold pack's a really good example. You put that over a wrist or a knee or whatever, and before too long you end up saying, well, it doesn't feel as cold. The reality is that the temp probably has not changed that much. What has changed is that my sensitivity to it, because my nerve endings have literally quit firing or not fired as intensely because the input hasn't changed. It's called habituation. We do it all the time. Hand in hot water, we say the water is losing its temp. Well, probably it isn't. Might be a few degrees, but to me, it starts feeling cold. Well, some of the heat in my hand has been diffused into the water, but also that element of habituation occurs. The interesting thing about that is that is part of our physiology, but it's also part of our psychology and how we interact with the world and see the world. There are certain things that we just expect will not change. And so we are more sensitive to the things that do. Now, even when I was using the stained glass, I can change things about my appearance behind that stained glass and you would never know it. But the stained glass stays the same, right? The appearance always stays the same, and I can make that appearance be anything I want it to be. In this case, it's usually whatever socially approved of image I can create. So there's that. There's the what I often refer to as kind of the ignorance of the familiar, okay? And how we tend to be blind to things. Another example of that, just as kind of a little rabbit trail, is something we call blind sight. And it connects up with this next point that I want to talk about, and that is the power of expectations. Because expectations drive what we see. Not what is actually happening, but what we see. And some very famous experiments were often done with changes in features of the person or in the environment, and people never, ever notice it. A classic example, which is a little humorous, I used to show it to my students, is a video of some people that were watching a video of basketball players that were throwing passes back and forth to one another. There was probably about a half dozen of them. And as they're throwing the passes back and forth to one another, the question to the audience was, count the number of passes that are made by the basketball players to one another. Now, while they're watching that, a gorilla, a costumed person, of course, but a gorilla walks into the scene, taps on his chest, and walks out of the scene. And after it's all over, the experimenters say, so how many passes? Well, there are some people that get, do a variety of answers or whatever. And they say, okay, good enough. That sounds good. And then they show it to them again without any prompting of what to pay attention to. And when they see the gorilla walk through and do his deal, they say, no, that was not in the video I saw. That literally was not there. They were completely dumbfounded by the idea that they had been shown exactly the same video, but they were blind to that. Why? Because their expectations made them blind to certain things. We only notice that which we have expectations of. And in a lot of cases, our expectations are completely invisible to us. We don't know what they are until something happens and they go unmet. And then we say, now that's a problem, because we'll say, well, somebody might say, well, that certainly wasn't what I expected. But what did you expect? Well, we didn't identify going in. But we usually have certain stable expectations about it, whatever the situation is that we're looking at. So expectations drive along what we see. So if anybody wants to try to make the point that our perceptions don't matter, only the reality does, that is out of step with the realities of how we function. While the reality is there, we will react to what we perceive. We will not necessarily react to what is actually there. And that is within the context of these looking for an external solution to an internal problem. Now, there's another issue that we have to contend with, and that is the demand that we have for outcomes rather than the investment in the process. And what I mean by that is our demand for an outcome, how things should be, which is key. I'll return to that in a second. But how things should be is a quality that is invisible to us in our relationships. That oftentimes when it's pointed out how controlling we're thinking or how controlling we are, we say, no, that's not it at all, because we check what our intent is or our desired outcome, even our desired outcome for the other person. Not for me, but for them. Is it a good one? Oh, yeah, sure, probably. But it's chosen for them without any of their input. And so when we are driven by a desired outcome and we do what is necessary to accomplish that outcome, even if it's good for that person, the impact is often silent but deadly. It truly is. And I say silent because the person doesn't recognize what's going on. They feel the level of shame that goes into it because they are not performing according to our expectations, as if those expectations are the absolute best. Because the reality is that if we are going to empower people, then we best give them the freedom to make the wrong choices. Now, they have the freedom whether we give it to them or not, but it's still there. So what we find ourselves in, and this is where this context of Scripture comes in, because we are looking for a logical solution for a quote-unquote illogical problem. See, our feelings are illogical, and because we put such a high value on logic and reasoning and reality, then the illogical is irrelevant. And it's a little bit like our logic, reasoning, and all of that is like a hammer. And we're like a little kid with a hammer. Everything is a nail. The cat, the dog, mom, dad, the coffee table, all of it. And we do exactly the same thing. That's how we tend to see. I was just in a sermon this morning, and we were talking about the idea of being present with God. And one of the things that I said to myself is, how can I be present with God when I can't even tolerate being present with myself? Because where does God live? And most Christians will tell you Jesus lives in my heart. And the littlest child in child ministries will get that. But if that's the case, then I go into my heart and I find God there and I find me there. And if I've already made a conclusion about the me not being good enough, being bad, never getting anything right, never pleasing anybody, then why would I go to that heart that God is waiting for me in anyway? So we tend to hammer away at logical belief solutions. So what I need to believe, and I heard this said even in the group that night, was I need to give it over to God. I need to believe in what is true. Yes, nobody's going to debate that point, but it is applying a solution to a different kind of problem. And in any other circumstances, we would see that as a dumb thing to do, okay? So when we go looking for a logical solution to an illogical problem, the first thing that happens is that there is a disconnect with the person, maybe us, that we're trying to help. Because we provide a logical solution or a fact-based reason or belief, and they're talking about, or I am experiencing, my feelings. And if we believe feelings are irrelevant and should be unattended to, because after all, they don't lead us anywhere good, then we're going to keep pounding away with that logical solution and reason and belief and expect it to change it, and it never does. And the thing that occurred to me this morning is we take a should solution. So don't be anxious. That's what Jesus said. That's a should solution, and we put it on an is problem. And that's not where, I'm going to butcher the English language for a second. That's not where I is. So how do I affirm, how do I accept where I am in order to embrace that which I'm being called to? I can't change anything if I don't accept what is there first. I can't move anywhere on the map if I haven't figured out where I am. And so when we seek to provide a logical or fact-based reason to do it differently, we are making an implicit statement about the things that the other person is experiencing or feeling, including us. And that's why, quite honestly, I think a lot of Christians fail at even remotely coming close to what Jesus called us to do. Because they think, well, belief should be enough. I believe it. I give it to God. So now what? But that's an is problem. That's how it should be. But that's an is problem. How do I do that? And this is the challenge. And it seems to fall out of our brain over and over and over again, is that we forget about the relationship with God being the first thing, not the add-on thing. Because we see our performance for God being the first thing and the relationship being the add-on thing. So when the person is talking about feelings they're experiencing and I'm throwing a fact-based solution at them at a feeling-driven problem, the danger is the person is listening, probably relatively politely or quietly, and they're hearing your brilliant analysis that is so eloquent with logic and reasoning and firm biblical belief. They hear all of that, and they translated it down into one thing. And you have no control over that, and that is, well, if that's true, and I'm feeling what I'm feeling, there must be something fundamentally wrong with me. And the people that are fact-based, belief-driven, actually would be arrogant enough to say, yeah, there is something wrong with you. There is. It's called sin, so repent from your sin, and then your anxiety will go away. If only that were true in their lives. So we end up, or they end up, feeling like a problem to be solved rather than a person to whom we need to connect. Now, what's the problem with that? Because hypothetically, somebody can buy into that idea. But somehow we have gotten the notion that if I connect with somebody, now I am condoning their behavior and I'm giving them permission to continue. And if I can pull out some snarkiness for just a second, someone died to do that, not you. No one died and left you in charge of the other person's spiritual journey or their relationship with Jesus. Connection is the means by which we empower them in the power of the Holy Spirit to make the changes they want to make. You know, there's an interesting study many, many years ago, and it was about a smoking cessation program. And they found something very, very interesting. And this is oftentimes supported in a variety of ways and has been supported over the years. And that is, you could take 100 people and you give them all the evidence, all the facts, all the consequences of their smoking, and 10% of those people will change. They will stop on a dime, more or less. And there's a lot of stories we've heard about any kind of other besetting sin or addiction or anything else. A lot of times we will have stories like that. So 10% of those people will change just based on the facts and the beliefs and the consequence, all the kind of boatload of information that points to how damaging smoking is, right? There's another 10% that gets all of that same information, and they say, screw it, I'm not doing that. I don't care what you say. I don't care what the consequences are. I'm going to do it anyway. That's the other 10%, okay? There's one big bulge in the middle, right? We've got 10% on one side, 10% on the other. We got one big bulge in the middle. And those are 80% of the people. The basis on which they change is in the context of support and connection over time. Not instantaneously, but over time. And that's true generally for a lot of addictions. Because smoking has a physiological component, just like a lot of other addictions do. The physiological component can be addressed in some level, but the connection component cannot. It's not simple. It's not easy. Oftentimes, we resist the humility that is required to be known in that way in order to make the kind of changes we desire. So even when you go to Scripture itself and go to what Jesus started out with, and he said, don't be anxious. And he gives all of the fact-based, logical reasoning behind all of that. And he gives the birds of the air. They don't rush around trying to figure out what they're going to eat or anything. They don't sow, they don't reap, they don't keep things in barns. God feeds them. And he points to that, right? And then another example, he says, how many of you, by being anxious, can add one single hour to your life? And we say, nothing. So where's my drink? Where's my cigarette? Where's my porn? Really? I can be given all the facts necessary, but I don't have anybody walking alongside of me who says, yeah, me too, I get it. It's really tough. But let's walk this thing together. Maybe you can figure out a way to do something differently. Or what about plants? Jesus gave that one too, right? Each day, plants, they don't do anything. They're clothed better than Solomon himself. I'm pointing over here because that's where my scripture is. And God clothes them even though they are temporary. It's like, okay, compelling evidence after compelling evidence. Jesus used it over and over and over again. And then he says, "O you of so little trust." He used the word little faith. You have so little trust. And then he points to something that is the key, and that is relationship with our Father in heaven and bringing our lives into alignment with being right with him. So he does fact, logic, and then he says relationship. Relationship. He says, you do that. And all these other things, all the evidence I gave you to not be anxious. And it's a different story. The landscape looks entirely different. All of these things will be added to you. All the needs that we have. But we don't trust. And when we don't trust, all that's left for us to do is to control things. That's all. Now, there's another problem I want to bring to our attention, because so often we use this card when we're trying to help somebody change or point something out. And basically, we point out the ridiculousness of or the uselessness of the anxiety. And while that is true, we end up using 20/20 hindsight. How did it all turn out? What do you think of it now? To solve a present problem that is not 20/20. It's easy to use after the fact information, otherwise known as ex post facto, to point to make a different choice. And while that may be true, attend to all that I've said just previously. It's not my job, and quite honestly, I don't have the power to change someone's mind. And no matter what mountain of evidence I can bring together to convince them, what kind of relationship do I have with them? Because if I'm trying to correct them with very little relationship, I don't know the contours of their heart, neither might they. They don't either, maybe. But if I don't facilitate that righteousness, that rightly related with God thing, then their hope of ever making that change is not there. And no matter how much evidence I can come up with or how much ridiculousness I can generate around whatever it is they're doing, that's not what changes people. What changes people is relationship with them and walking their lives with them as it is, not as it should be. Because, see, we use should solutions for is problems. Should is not real. It obscures reality in a lot of cases. And so a lot of times we use should answers for is problems. Well, I just need to give it to God. Okay, then what? Well, I give it to God. Okay, then what? What's tomorrow? What do you do with tomorrow? Of course, Jesus points out, tomorrow's got enough trouble of its own. Let's just deal with the things that are going on today. The is, not the what should be, the is. So oftentimes we will plaster over the ugly reality with spiritual platitudes. And as you, no doubt you have probably heard the comment, it is like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. And we hope that it will fix it. And the reality, the thing is, that is in so many of our relationships, is that we don't want to look at the person who is offering those solutions and say, that is all well and good, but that is not where I am. That is not helpful. It isn't. While I know you're well-intentioned, your intentions don't help me change. Walking with me through it might. There's no guarantees. Not with humans. They have this annoying quality, which you and I both have too, right? Free will. We love to rhapsodize about freedom, but we hate freedom. Because not only does it carry with it responsibility, but we hate freedom because people can choose wrongly. Will I love them still? Will I accept them still? Not condoning the choices they make, but loving the person who's making the choice. Now, there's some trite sayings out there, not the least of which is love the sin or hate the sin. But that trite phrase blows past what exactly the love part of that looks like in terms of a very hard-nosed, tenacious, absolutely committed relationship with somebody in the face of terrible choices they're making. And if anybody's been a parent, they know that that's tested. We demand solutions when God is calling us to process relationships. The interesting thing about this, and I'll end on this point, but the interesting thing about this is that was God's strategy too. His strategy was to remove all the law, all the demands, so that we could choose a relationship with him and find out that there is actually abundant life on the other side of that. But he put all of his chips in the center of the table on relationship. And you know why? Because before time, there was relationship. It's called the Trinity. And that's what he is calling us to. Is it messy? Yes. Is it easy? Far from it. Is there abundance to be had? Yes. But that we're often blinded to that, and that's very much a part of our broken humanness. Us pounding it with the hammer of logic and reasoning is not going to change it. Can I live out that reasoning? Yeah, actually I can. But I can live it out in the relationship without spending all of my time trying to correct how somebody is thinking. Actually, they may reconsider their thoughts on their own in the context of that relationship that you have with them. And that's where redemption happens, because you and I both know that's where our redemption happened. And that's crazy, wild, incredibly powerful stuff that Paul pointed to, that the power that it took to resurrect Christ lives in us if we could just figure out not to impose it on other people, but to invite them into it. That's it. And it sounds so uncomplicated, but I am not naive enough to think that it is. It isn't because of us. Not only the other person, but because of us. And that's where we come to the end. And so resist the temptation. I'll just kind of draw this together, but I ain't putting any bow on it because there isn't one. Resist the temptation to look for an external solution to an internal problem, which is namely wrestling with and learning and understanding the landscape of your own heart. And there is where you will find God, and there is where you will find freedom. Because the one thing I can tell you unequivocally is that love flourishes in freedom. If there's no freedom, there is not love. There is a grit your teeth, white-knuckled compliance, but the motivation isn't love. It's the avoidance of something else, and that's a different thing. So that's it for today. If you have questions, if there's anything that pops up as I've been talking that you want more clarification on, please feel free to DM me on Instagram. We can be found there at the Psych Monologues, at the Psych Monologues. I can be found on Facebook at ray.mitch or LinkedIn drmitch. Additional resources that are always under development is one that is available to people to support the mission and vision of the outposts and everything else connected to SGI, is a digital devotional that is built on talking about this relationship and how do I build healthy relationships. And that's what it's for. And so you'll get a email every few days in your inbox just to remind you how to stay the course on and stay the focus on relationships and cultivating those kind of relationships that are free, where love flourishes within it. So you'll get it every few days per week. And you can sign up for a month, you can sign up for a half a year, you can sign up for a whole year if you want to have that resource come into your inbox on a regular basis. You can find us anywhere on any platform that you listen to podcasts. That includes Spotify, iTunes, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, wherever that is. And if you're interested in partnering with us financially, we would be ever so grateful, not only to grow and continue to develop our scholarship fund for people who want to participate in the silent retreats, whether that's alumni of CCU or whether that's people from other places in the country that hear about this and want to get involved. Obviously, if you're coming in from another part of the country here to Colorado, there's the added expense of flying and everything else. But we can do the best we can to help you arrange for rides and everything to be on and meeting us at the Silent Retreat House on a Thursday evening, and then we close up shop after lunch on Sunday. So if you want to support us in that way, again, we would be so grateful. We've got a huge goal that is kind of front and center on the radar, and that is just to help us create a web presence that's credible, that is secure, that continues to develop these digital communities, if you will, online communities of people that are outposts for the heart online. Hopefully, Lord willing, we can plant them in physical places with leaders that are trained to facilitate this kind of community. And it will look a little different everywhere. I understand that it should, as it did even in Bible times. So if you want to partner with us, please do. You can do it. There's a donate button at the bottom of the page. Be sure to note that there's a sign up button for the silent retreats, but there's a donate button to the work and mission of SGI, and we would be ever so grateful for any donation that you have. We are tax deductible. We are a tax exempt organization, so all of your gifts are tax deductible. If you prefer to send a physical check, you can certainly do that. You simply make the check out to Stained Glass International, send it to SGI P.O. Box 322, East Lake, Colorado 80614, Box 322. You may have heard other podcasts I referenced a different P.O. box. We've got a different one, quite honestly, so I don't have to get on my hands and knees to look in this one. And so it's a different box numbers, 322. And if you want to send us a physical check, you're welcome to do that as well. We would be ever so grateful to continue the ministry, continue to develop digital communities and live communities, in-person communities, wherever people feel so inclined to gather together and create these kind of outposts that I've been talking about. So that's it for today. Thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate your investment in time. I count it a privilege that we get to have this time together. Come back next week. I'll be here waiting for you. And until then, love you. Later.